Hello, and welcome to Blessed Sleep, where faith meets rest through the timeless wisdom of Scripture. Tonight, we will share the journey of a young shepherd named Tobias, a narrative inspired by Psalm 91, one of the most powerful declarations of divine protection in all of Scripture. This story explores the transforming power of trust in the midst of fear and uncertainty, and teaches us about the sheltering presence of the Most High God. Through Tobias's journey from terror to unshakable faith, we will discover what it truly means to dwell in the secret place of the Almighty and rest under the shadow of His wings. As you listen, allow these faith-filled words to envelop you, bringing tranquility to your mind and renewal to your spirit. Let the gentle guidance of biblical wisdom lead you to a place of complete peace, resting in the presence of God. If this video blesses you, I would be deeply grateful if you could take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. Your support allows me to continue sharing God's wisdom through these stories, creating more content designed to bring peace and spiritual refreshment through Scripture-inspired narratives. Now, take a deep breath, settle into God's presence, and let us begin tonight's journey through this blessed story. The sun had not yet risen over the hills of Judea when Tobias awoke on the rooftop of his father's house. The stars still hung like silver lamps in the deep blue canvas above, and the air carried that particular coolness that comes just before dawn breaks. He lay still for a moment, listening to the familiar sounds of his world awakening. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster announced the coming day. Below, in the courtyard, he could hear his mother already moving about, preparing the morning bread. The scent of smoke from rekindled cooking fires drifted up from neighboring homes, mixing with the sweet smell of dew on the earth. Tobias was 17 years old, with dark eyes that had seen more than most boys his age, and hands already calloused from years of shepherding his father's modest flock. His family was not wealthy, but they had enough. 50 sheep grazed on the rocky hillsides surrounding their village of Beth Zur, a small settlement perched on the ridgeline between Jerusalem and Hebron. It was ancient land, walked by patriarchs, and every stone seemed to carry the weight of history and the whisper of God's covenant with His people. Rising from his sleeping mat, Tobias wrapped his woolen cloak around his shoulders and descended the outer stairs to the courtyard. His father, Micah, was already there, checking the leather straps of the water-skin that Tobias would carry into the wilderness. Micah was a man of few words, but his hands spoke volumes as they worked, testing each knot and buckle with the care of someone who understood that in the shepherd's world a broken strap could mean the difference between life and death. "Shalom, Abba," Tobias said quietly, using the tender word for father that had been on his lips since childhood. "Shalom, my son," Micah replied, looking up with eyes that reflected both love and concern. "You will take the flock to the eastern pastures today?" Tobias nodded. The grass there should still be good. The winter rains were generous this year. His mother, Naomi, emerged from the house carrying a cloth bundle. Inside was bread, dried figs, and a small portion of goat cheese. She pressed it into his hands, and her fingers lingered on his for just a moment longer than necessary. Tobias saw something in her eyes that morning, a shadow of worry that she tried to hide behind her usual smile. "The wilderness can be treacherous, Tobias," she said softly. "Keep your eyes open. There have been reports of lions in the eastern valleys." Lions! The word settled into Tobias's stomach like a stone. Every shepherd knew the danger. Just 2 months earlier, a boy from a neighboring village had been killed while trying to protect his flock from a lion's attack. His body had been found 3 days later. The whole region had mourned. "I will be careful, Emma," Tobias assured her, though he felt his heart quicken at the thought. His father placed a strong hand on his shoulder. "Remember what the elders teach us, son. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." We who tend sheep must first remember that we ourselves are tended by one greater than all. Tobias nodded, though in truth those words felt distant to him that morning. They were beautiful words, certainly. He had heard them recited in the synagogue countless times, but standing in the gray pre-dawn light, about to venture into wild country where predators hunted and bandits roamed, the words seemed as insubstantial as morning mist. The sheep knew his voice, and they stirred as he approached the stone pen where they had spent the night. He counted them as they filed out through the narrow gate, his staff guiding them, his voice making the soft, clicking sounds that told them to move forward. 50 pairs of eyes, 50 lives for which he was responsible. The weight of that responsibility pressed on him, as it always did, when he led them out beyond the safety of the village walls. The path eastward wound down through terraced olive groves where ancient trees twisted toward heaven with silvered trunks that had stood for generations. As the sun finally broke over the horizon, it painted the limestone hills in shades of gold and amber. The sheep moved in their timeless way, unhurried, stopping occasionally to nibble at whatever vegetation presented itself. Tobias walked behind them, his staff in one hand, his sling tucked into his belt. He was skilled with the sling. His father had trained him well, and he could strike a mark the size of a man's fist from 30 paces. But what good was a sling against a lion? The thought kept returning to him as the morning wore on. His mind conjured images of the great cats he had seen only from a distance, their powerful shoulders, their terrible teeth. He had heard their roars echoing through the valleys at night, sounds that made even grown men pull their cloaks tighter and move closer to the fire. What would he do if one appeared? Would he have the courage to stand between the beast and his sheep? or would fear freeze him in place, making him useless? By midday they had reached the eastern pastures, a broad valley where a seasonal stream still trickled between rocks, creating pools where the sheep could drink. The grass here was indeed good, still green despite the advancing spring. Tobias found a flat rock in the shade of a solitary terebinth tree and sat down to eat his midday meal. The bread was still slightly warm, and the cheese was sharp on his tongue. He ate slowly, watching the flock spread out across the valley floor. It was in moments like these, alone with the sheep and the sky, that Tobias felt the full weight of his own smallness. The hills stretched endlessly in all directions. Somewhere beyond them lay the great sea to the west and the vast deserts to the east. Jerusalem, with its great temple, was only a day's walk north, but it might as well have been in another world. Here there was only rock and sky, and the constant presence of danger lurking just beyond sight. A movement caught his eye. On the far ridge, perhaps a quarter-mile distant, something moved among the rocks. Tobias's heart stopped. He rose slowly, his hand moving instinctively to his sling. The sheep, sensing his tension, bleated nervously. For several long moments, Tobias stared at that distant ridge, trying to distinguish between rock and shadow and living threat. Then the shape resolved itself into a man, then two men, then three. They were moving along the ridge, picking their way through the rocks. Bandits? Travelers? Tobias couldn't tell from this distance. He remained motionless, hoping they wouldn't notice him and his flock in the valley below. His mouth had gone dry, and he realized he was holding his breath. The figures paused. One of them seemed to point in his direction. Tobias's mind raced. If they were bandits, they would see his flock as easy plunder. 50 sheep could be sold for a considerable sum in any market. And what was he? A lone boy with a sling and a wooden staff. He would be no obstacle to grown men with swords and spears. But then the figures moved on, continuing their journey along the ridge until they disappeared behind the curve of the hill. Tobias released his breath in a long, shaky exhale. His legs felt weak, and he sat down heavily on his rock. Only then did he realize that his hands were trembling. This was the reality of his life as a shepherd. Every day carried the potential for disaster. Every shadow could hide a threat. And what protection did he really have? His sling? His staff? They were children's toys compared to the real dangers that roamed these hills. That evening, as he guided the flock back toward home, Tobias found himself thinking about the words his father had spoken that morning. "The Lord is my shepherd." But how could he trust in an invisible shepherd when the threats he faced were so terribly visible? How could ancient words provide protection against very real lions and very real bandits? The village of Beth Zur looked beautiful in the fading light, its stone houses clustered together on the hillside like a flock of sheep themselves, seeking safety in numbers. Smoke rose from evening fires, and Tobias could hear the distant sound of voices as people called to one another, ending their day's work. It was the sound of safety, of community, of home. But as Tobias counted his sheep back into their pen, making sure all 50 had returned safely, his father noticed the trouble in his eyes. "You saw something today?" Micah said. It was not a question. Tobias told him about the men on the ridge, about the fear that had gripped him, about the trembling that had come afterward. As he spoke, he felt ashamed, as if admitting fear was admitting weakness. His father listened in silence, his weathered face thoughtful in the dimming light. When Tobias finished, Micah was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant, as if looking at something far away. "I was about your age," Micah finally said, "when I first took the flock into the wilderness alone. My father had died suddenly, and the responsibility fell to me ready or not. I remember lying awake at night, terrified of everything that could go wrong. Lions, bandits, wolves, sickness, drought. The list of fears was endless." "How did you overcome it?" Tobias asked. "I didn't," his father said simply. "Not right away. Fear is not something that simply disappears because we wish it to. But I learned something important during those years. I learned that faith is not the absence of fear. Faith is choosing to trust even when fear is present." He placed his hand on Tobias's shoulder. "Tomorrow is Shabbat. Come with me to the synagogue. There is someone I want you to meet." The next morning, Tobias walked with his father through the village to the small stone building that served as their place of assembly and prayer. The sun was warm on their backs, and the air smelled of baking bread. Families were making their way toward the synagogue, dressed in their Shabbat clothes, the men with their prayer shawls draped over their shoulders, the women walking together in small groups, their voices creating a gentle murmur of conversation. Inside, the synagogue was cool and dim, lit only by the oil lamps that hung from iron hooks. The scrolls of the law were kept in a carved wooden ark at the front, and the seats were simple stone benches arranged in rows. Tobias found a place beside his father and let the familiar rhythms of the Shabbat service wash over him. The prayers, the readings, the ancient words that connected them to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, to Moses and David, to all the generations of faithful who had walked this land before them. After the service, Micah led Tobias to a corner of the courtyard where an old man sat on a bench in the shade. His name was Eleazar, and he was one of the village elders, a man known for his wisdom and his deep knowledge of the Scriptures. His beard was white as wool, and his eyes, though aged, were sharp and clear. "Shalom, Eleazar," Micah said respectfully. "I have brought my son to speak with you." The old man gestured for Tobias to sit beside him. "Your father tells me you are troubled, young shepherd." Tobias hesitated, then nodded. "I am afraid," he admitted. "Every day when I take the flock into the wilderness, I am afraid of what might happen. I know what the Scriptures say about trusting God, but when I am out there alone, facing real dangers, the words seem empty." Eleazar studied him for a long moment. "Do you know Psalm 91?" he asked. Tobias shook his head. "It is a psalm of protection," Eleazar said, "of dwelling in the shelter of the Most High. Let me teach it to you." And there, in the quiet courtyard, with the morning sun filtering through the olive branches overhead, the old man began to recite words that would change Tobias's life. "He who dwells in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress, my God. In Him I will trust." The words were like cool water on parched ground. Tobias felt something stir within him as Eleazar continued, his voice steady and sure. "Surely he shall deliver you from the snare of the fowler and from the perilous pestilence. He shall cover you with his feathers, and under his wings you shall take refuge. His truth shall be your shield and buckler." Under his wings. The image settled into Tobias's imagination. He thought of the mother hens he had seen in his own courtyard, gathering their chicks under their wings when a hawk circled overhead. The chicks would run to their mother and disappear into the safety of her feathers, and the hawk, no matter how fierce, could not reach them there. "You shall not be afraid of the terror by night, nor of the arrow that flies by day, nor of the pestilence that walks in darkness, nor of the destruction that lays waste at noonday. Terror by night, arrow by day." The psalm seemed to know exactly what Tobias feared. It acknowledged the reality of danger, but pointed to a reality beyond danger, a protection that transcended the threats of the physical world. Eleazar paused and looked at Tobias intently. "These are not empty words, boy. They are the testimony of those who have learned to dwell in God's presence. But you cannot learn them from me. You must learn them yourself in the wilderness, when you face your fears. Only then will they become real to you." "But how?" Tobias asked. "How do I learn to dwell in this secret place?" The old man smiled. "That is the question, isn't it? The secret place is not a location you can walk to. It is a position of the heart, a choice you make in every moment to trust that God is who He says He is. It begins with a decision, but it deepens through experience." He leaned forward, his eyes serious. "The wilderness is coming for you, Tobias. Not just the physical wilderness where you tend your sheep, but the wilderness of the soul. The place where your faith will be tested. When that time comes, remember these words. Speak them, live them, and you will discover that they are more solid than stone." Tobias left the synagogue that day with the psalm turning over and over in his mind. He who dwells in the secret place of the Most High What did it mean to dwell there? How could he find this place? The week that followed was uneventful. Each morning, Tobias led his flock into the eastern valleys, and each evening he brought them safely home. But something had changed. He found himself reciting the words of the psalm as he walked, letting them become familiar on his tongue. He shall cover you with his feathers, and under his wings you shall take refuge. The more he spoke them, the more they seemed to take root inside him, like seeds planted in soil, beginning to germinate. Then came the morning that would test everything. Tobias woke before dawn as usual, but the sky was different. Heavy clouds hung low over the hills, and the air had the metallic smell that presaged rain. His mother urged him to stay home, to keep the flock in their pen, but they needed to graze, and the pastures near the village were overgrazed and depleted. The eastern valleys were their best hope for good grass. "I will be careful," Tobias promised, though he felt the familiar knot of anxiety in his stomach. The journey out was slow. The sheep sensed the coming storm and were skittish, harder to control than usual. By the time they reached the valley where the stream ran, the first drops of rain had begun to fall. Within an hour, it had become a downpour. The seasonal stream quickly swelled into a rushing torrent, and the valley floor turned slick with mud. Tobias found what shelter he could beneath an overhanging rock face, and huddled there with his staff across his knees, watching the flock scatter across the valley, seeking their own shelter. The rain was cold, driven by a fierce wind that seemed to come from all directions at once. Lightning split the sky, and thunder rolled across the hills like the voice of God himself, terrible and magnificent. It was during one of these thunderclaps that Tobias heard it. A sound that made his blood turn to ice, a roar. Deep and primal, it cut through even the storm's fury. Tobias's head snapped up, his eyes scanning the valley through the sheets of rain. There, on the far side of the swollen stream, a lion had emerged from the rocks. It was a male, its mane dark with rain, its body massive and powerful, and it was moving toward the flock. The sheep panicked. They scattered in all directions, their bleating cries of terror barely audible above the storm. Several of them, in their panic, ran directly toward the raging stream. Tobias watched in horror as 3 of them plunged into the water and were immediately swept away by the current. But the lion wasn't interested in those. It had fixed its eyes on a young ewe that had become separated from the others, trapped against a rocky outcropping with nowhere to run. The great cat moved with terrible purpose, its muscles rippling beneath its wet fur. Tobias's mind went blank with terror. Every instinct screamed at him to stay hidden, to let the lion take the sheep and be grateful it wasn't taking him. He was one boy with a sling and a staff against one of nature's most efficient killers. It was suicide to intervene. But then, cutting through the panic, came the words he had been memorizing all week. "He shall cover you with his feathers, and under his wings you shall take refuge. You shall not be afraid of the terror by night, nor of the arrow that flies by day. In that moment, Tobias understood something profound. Faith was not a feeling. It was not confidence or certainty or the absence of fear. Faith was a choice. It was choosing to believe and act on that belief, even when everything in you wanted to do the opposite. He stepped out from under the rock overhang. The rain immediately plastered his hair to his head and soaked through his cloak. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely load a stone into his sling. But he did it. He fitted the smooth river stone into the leather pouch, and he began to spin the sling over his head the way his father had taught him 1,000 times. Hashem! He shouted into the storm, using the sacred name. You are my refuge and my fortress. In you I will trust. The lion had reached the trapped ewe. It crouched, preparing to spring. Tobias released the stone. The world seemed to slow. He saw the stone arc through the rain, saw it strike the lion's shoulder. The hit wasn't deadly, but it was enough to get the beast's attention. The great head swung toward him, and for one eternal moment Tobias stared into the eyes of the lion. Terror froze him. The lion began to move toward him, abandoning the sheep, this new threat demanding its attention. Tobias could see its muscles bunching, preparing to charge. He fumbled for another stone, but his hands wouldn't cooperate. The sling slipped from his fingers and fell into the mud. The lion roared again, so close now that Tobias could see its teeth, could smell its wet fur and the blood on its breath from some previous kill. This was it. This was how he would die. Alone in a valley during a storm, torn apart by a lion while trying to save a sheep. His mother would weep. His father would be left without an heir. All because he had been foolish enough to stand against something so much more powerful than himself. But then something happened that Tobias would never fully be able to explain. A brilliant flash of lightning struck the hillside above them, so close that the thunderclap was instantaneous and deafening. The entire valley lit up like daylight, and in that moment of illumination, Tobias saw the lion freeze. The great cat's ears flattened against its head, and it let out a sound Tobias had never heard from a predator before, a sound of fear. The lion turned and fled. It bounded back across the rocks and disappeared into the wilderness from which it had come, leaving Tobias standing alone in the rain, alive, untouched, trembling from head to foot. Tobias fell to his knees in the mud. He didn't know if he was laughing or crying or both. His whole body shook with the aftermath of terror and the overwhelming rush of deliverance. Around him, the sheep began to tentatively emerge from their hiding places. The ewe that had been trapped picked her way carefully across the rocks and rejoined the flock. Surely he shall deliver you from the snare of the fowler and from the perilous pestilence, Tobias whispered into the rain. His truth shall be your shield and buckler. The words were no longer just words. They were testimony. They were his story now. He had stood in the valley of the shadow of death, and he had not been alone. Whether it was the lightning that had frightened the lion or something else, something more, Tobias knew with absolute certainty that he had been protected. He had been covered by wings he could not see but had felt all the same. The storm began to ease. The rain slackened to a drizzle, and breaks appeared in the clouds. Tobias gathered his scattered flock, counting them carefully. He had lost 3 to the stream, and his heart ached for those, but 47 remained. 47 lives that would return safely home because he had chosen in his moment of greatest fear to trust rather than flee. The journey back to Bethzer took hours. The path was treacherous with mud, and the swollen stream had to be crossed at a different point. But Tobias made the journey in a state of wonder, as if seeing the world for the first time. The storm had cleared, and the late afternoon sun broke through the clouds, painting everything in shades of gold. Steam rose from the wet rocks. Birds emerged and began to sing. The whole earth seemed to be celebrating its renewal after the rain. When Bethzer finally came into view, Tobias saw his father standing at the village edge, clearly having been watching for him. Micah's face transformed from worry to relief as he counted the returning sheep. He ran down the path to meet his son, and for a long moment they simply stood there, the older shepherd and the younger, while the flock milled around them. "I heard the storm," Micah said quietly. "I was afraid." "So was I," Tobias admitted. "There was a lion, Abba. It came for the flock, and I stood against it." Micah's eyes widened. "You faced a lion?" "I had no choice, or rather, I had a choice, and I chose to trust. I remembered the psalm Eleazar taught me, and Abba, the words, they were true, all of them. I felt it. I felt his covering, his protection. The lion fled, but it wasn't because of me. It was because I wasn't alone out there." His father embraced him then, holding him tightly. "You have learned what cannot be taught," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You have learned that his wings are real." That evening, after the sheep were safely penned and Tobias had washed and changed into dry clothes, the family gathered for their evening meal. His mother kept touching his face, as if reassuring herself that he was truly home and whole. The bread tasted better than Tobias could ever remember, and the wine his father poured tasted like joy itself. Later, as the stars emerged in the cleared sky, Tobias climbed to the rooftop. He lay on his mat and looked up at the vast canopy of heaven, at the countless lights that God had set in place. Somewhere out in the wilderness, the lion prowled. Somewhere, other dangers lurked in the darkness, but Tobias felt, for the first time in his life, truly at peace. He began to recite the psalm, letting each word settle into his heart like stones building a fortress. "He who dwells in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress, my God, in Him I will trust." The words rose into the night air, a declaration and a testimony, and as Tobias spoke them, he realized he was no longer trying to convince himself. He was simply stating what he now knew to be true. In the days that followed, word of Tobias's encounter spread through Bethzer, and the surrounding villages. Other shepherds came to hear his story, sitting in his father's courtyard while Tobias recounted what had happened in the valley. Some seemed skeptical, thinking perhaps the lion had simply been frightened by the lightning and nothing more. But others, especially the older shepherds, who had lived long enough to accumulate their own stories of impossible deliverances, nodded knowingly. Eleazar came to see him as well. The old man listened to the entire account without interruption, his eyes bright with something like recognition. "You have entered the secret place," he said when Tobias finished. "Not many find it so young. Most of us spend a lifetime circling around it, catching only glimpses. But you stood at the threshold of death and chose trust over terror. That choice opened a door, and you walked through." "But I was still afraid," Tobias protested. "Even when I stepped out to face the lion, I was terrified." "Of course you were," Eleazar said. "The secret place is not a location where fear cannot exist. It is a place where fear cannot rule. You felt the fear and acted in faith anyway. That is the dwelling place of the Most High. That is what it means to abide under the shadow of the Almighty." He placed his weathered hand on Tobias's shoulder. "The psalm promises that 1,000 may fall at your side and 10,000 at your right hand, but it shall not come near you." This doesn't mean you will never face danger. It means that when danger comes, you will not face it alone. You will face it from within the shelter of his wings. Tobias thought about this as the weeks passed, and he continued his daily routine of shepherding. Each morning he would lead the flock into the wilderness, and each evening he would bring them home. But something fundamental had changed. The fears that had once tormented him, while not gone completely, no longer controlled him. When he heard a strange sound in the rocks, he would recite the psalm. When storms gathered on the horizon, he would remind himself of God's covering. When night fell and shadows lengthened, he would remember that he dwelt in the secret place of the Most High. One evening, about a month after his encounter with the lion, Tobias was bringing the flock home along the familiar path when he saw a young boy sitting beside the trail, crying. The child couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old, and his tunic was torn and dirty. He looked up as Tobias approached, his face streaked with tears. "What's wrong?" Tobias asked gently, bringing the flock to a halt. "I'm lost," the boy sobbed. "I was gathering firewood, and I went too far from my village, and now I don't know how to get home. And it's getting dark, and my mother will be worried, and there are lions in these hills, and I'm going to die out here." The words tumbled out in a rush of terror, and Tobias saw himself in this boy. He saw his own fear, his own certainty of doom, his own helplessness in the face of dangers too large to overcome. He knelt down beside the child. "What is your name?" "Daniel," the boy whispered. "Well, Daniel, my name is Tobias, and I am a shepherd. Do you know what a shepherd does?" The boy shook his head. A shepherd protects his flock. He guides them through dangerous places. He stands between them and anything that would harm them. And do you know what? You and I, we have a shepherd too. One who is much stronger than me, much wiser than any man. He watches over us even when we can't see him. But I'm so scared, Daniel said. I know, Tobias replied. I've been scared too. In fact, I was scared every day until something happened that taught me a secret. Would you like to know the secret? The boy nodded, his tears slowing. The secret is that when we are afraid, we can choose to trust that God is protecting us. It's like He has great wings, like an eagle, and we can hide under those wings. Nothing can reach us there. No lion, no darkness, no danger. We might still feel afraid, but we don't have to let that fear control us. Tobias stood and held out his hand. Come, your village is probably just over that ridge. I will walk with you, and my flock will come with us. And while we walk, I'll teach you something my teacher taught me. It's a psalm, a song of protection. If you learn it, you can say it whenever you're afraid. As they walked through the gathering dusk, Tobias began to recite Psalm 91, line by line, having Daniel repeat each phrase after him. The boy's voice was shaky at first, but as they walked and the words became familiar, his voice grew stronger. He who dwells in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. He who dwells in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. Daniel echoed. I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress, my God. In Him I will trust. I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress, my God. In Him I will trust. They crested the ridge, and there below them was a small village, much like Bethzur. Lights glowed in the windows, and Tobias could see people moving about, clearly searching for something or someone. Daniel! A woman's voice carried across the distance. Daniel! That's my mother, the boy cried out, his face transforming with relief. He looked up at Tobias. Thank you. Thank you for finding me. Remember the secret place, Tobias said. Remember that you can dwell there, no matter what happens. He watched as Daniel ran down the hill into his mother's arms, watched as she held him and wept with relief. And Tobias felt something expand in his chest, a warm certainty that this was part of his calling, not just to protect sheep, but to share the shelter he had found, to be in some small way a reflection of the greater shepherd who had covered him with his wings. As spring turned to summer, Tobias continued his work. But he found opportunities to share what he had learned. When travelers passed through Bethzur, he would offer them water and rest, and often he would share the psalm with them. When other shepherds spoke of their fears, he would tell them about the secret place, not boastfully, but as one who had found water in the desert and wanted others to drink as well. His reputation began to change. Where once he had been known as Micah's son, the quiet boy who kept to himself, he became known as Tobias the shepherd, the one who trusted God. Young men would seek him out to ask about faith. Fathers would bring their sons to hear his story, and always Tobias would point not to himself, but to the one who had sheltered him. One evening, as he sat on his rooftop, watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant oranges and purples, his father joined him. "You've changed," Micah said simply. "Have I?" Tobias asked. "When I look at you now, I don't see the frightened boy who left here that stormy morning. I see a young man who has found something precious, something more valuable than all the flocks of Judea." "I've found the secret place, Abba," Tobias said. "Or rather, it found me." "When I had nowhere else to turn, when I stood before that lion with nothing but my fear and a stone in my sling, I discovered that I had been dwelling there all along without knowing it. Every time I whispered a prayer, every time I hoped that God was watching over me, I was already there. I just didn't know it yet." Micah nodded slowly. "And now?" "Now I know that no matter where I go, no matter what dangers I face, I dwell in the shelter of the Most High. His wings cover me. His truth is my shield. I may not always feel it. There may be times when I am afraid again. But I know it's true because I have experienced it, and that changes everything." The summer months brought their own challenges. A drought settled over the land, and the pastures turned brown. Water sources dried up, and Tobias had to lead the flock farther and farther in search of grass and water. It was during these expeditions that he met other shepherds, some from villages days away, all struggling with the same difficulties. Around evening fires, as they watered their flocks at the few remaining wells, the shepherds would share stories. They spoke of lost sheep, of narrow escapes from predators, of bandits and wild weather, and Tobias would listen, and then he would share the psalm that had become his anchor. Some dismissed it as just words. "Poetry is lovely," one older shepherd said, "but it doesn't fill a dried-up well or fend off a wolf that's already in the flock." But others listened. There was a young shepherd named Seth, barely 14, who came to sit beside Tobias one evening as the flocks mingled at a shared watering hole. The boy's hands trembled as he held his staff, and his eyes kept darting to the darkening hills. "They say you faced a lion," Seth said quietly. Tobias nodded, watching the last light fade from the western sky. "I did. Were you afraid?" "Terrified," Tobias admitted, "more afraid than I'd ever been in my life." Seth looked surprised. "But you stood anyway. How? How did you make your fear go away?" "I didn't," Tobias said. He turned to look at the boy, seeing his own younger self in those anxious eyes. "The fear didn't go away, but I learned something that day. I learned that there is a place we can dwell even when we're afraid. A secret place, not a physical location, but a position of trust. When I stood before that lion, I wasn't standing alone. I was standing under the shadow of the Almighty." He began to recite the psalm, and Seth listened, his eyes growing wide as each verse unfolded. When Tobias finished, the boy was silent for a long moment. "Will you teach it to me?" Seth asked finally. "All of it?" And so, as the stars emerged one by one in the vast canopy above, Tobias taught the psalm to young Seth, line by line, the way Eleazar had taught it to him. The words passed from one generation to the next, a living tradition of trust being handed down like a torch in the darkness. The drought eventually broke. Late summer rains came, gentle at first, then more substantial. The hills turned green again, and the wells refilled. But something else had happened during those dry months. Word of Tobias and his psalm had spread through the network of shepherds who roamed these hills. He had become known as one who knew how to dwell in the secret place. One afternoon, as Tobias was guiding his flock through a narrow valley, he noticed a figure sitting on a boulder ahead. As he drew closer, he recognized the man. It was Samuel, a shepherd from a village 3 days' journey to the south. Samuel was older than Tobias, perhaps 30 years, with the weathered face of someone who had spent decades in the sun and wind. But today, his face carried a weight that had nothing to do with weather. "Shalom, Tobias," Samuel said, rising from the rock. "Shalom, Samuel. What brings you so far from your grazing lands?" Samuel looked down at his hands. "My son, he's sick. The fever has been on him for 5 days now, and it's getting worse. My wife is beside herself with worry. The elders have prayed, but the fever won't break. I heard you know words, powerful words of protection." Tobias felt the weight of the man's hope pressing against him. "The words I know are not magic, Samuel. They're not incantations that guarantee outcomes. They're declarations of trust in the one who holds all outcomes in his hands." "But they helped you against the lion." "They did," Tobias agreed, "but not because the words themselves have power. They helped because they anchored me to the truth of God's presence. They reminded me that I wasn't alone." Samuel's shoulders sagged. "So you can't help." "I didn't say that," Tobias said gently. He guided his flock to a place where they could graze, then sat down beside Samuel on the boulder. "Tell me about your son." Samuel's voice broke as he spoke. The boy was 8 years old, his only son, bright and curious, with a laugh that filled their small house with joy. The fever had come suddenly, after the boy had played in the stream one hot afternoon. Now he lay on his mat, burning up, sometimes delirious, calling out words that made no sense. As Tobias listened, he thought about his own journey, about the terror in the valley, about the moment when he had chosen to step out from safety, about the lightning that had driven the lion away. He thought about Daniel, the lost boy he had guided home, and about Seth, learning the psalm by starlight. "Come," he said to Samuel, "let's go to your son." They traveled together, Tobias leaving word with a neighboring shepherd to watch his flock. The journey took them through country Tobias had never seen before, following dried riverbeds and ancient paths that wound between hills of chalk and flint. As they walked, Tobias taught Samuel the psalm. The older man's voice was rough at first, stumbling over the unfamiliar words, but gradually he found the rhythm. He shall cover you with his feathers, and under his wings you shall take refuge. Samuel repeated it, and Tobias heard the desperation in his voice, the grasping for hope like a drowning man reaching for a branch. Don't just speak the words, Tobias said. Let them speak to you. Listen to what they're saying. God is not distant. He is not unconcerned. He is like a mother bird spreading her wings over her young. Your son is not outside that covering. They reached Samuel's village on the third day, as the sun was setting. It was smaller than Beth-zur. Perhaps 20 families clustered around a central well. Samuel's wife, Rachel, met them at the door of their home. Her eyes were red from weeping, and when she saw her husband, she fell into his arms. "He's worse," she whispered. "I don't think he'll last the night." Inside the small house, a lamp burned low beside a sleeping mat where a small boy lay. His face was flushed with fever, and his breathing was shallow and rapid. His lips moved slightly, forming words that never quite emerged into sound. Tobias knelt beside the mat and placed his hand on the boy's forehead. The heat was intense, radiating from the small body like stones baked in a noonday sun. Tobias closed his eyes and began to pray, not with elaborate words or ritual formulas, but with the simple honesty of one speaking to someone he knew. "Hashem," he whispered, "this boy is yours. His parents love him, but you love him more. You formed him in his mother's womb. You know the number of hairs on his head. He dwells in your secret place, whether he knows it or not, whether we see it or not. Cover him with your wings. Let your truth be his shield." Then he began to recite the psalm, slowly letting each word rest in the air before moving to the next. Samuel and Rachel joined in where they could, Samuel's newly learned words mixing with his wife's tears. "You shall not be afraid of the terror by night, nor of the arrow that flies by day, nor of the pestilence that walks in darkness, nor of the destruction that lays waste at noonday." The lamplight flickered. Outside, the evening sounds of the village settled into night. Dogs barked in the distance. Someone called out a greeting. Life continued its eternal rhythm while in this small house a family held vigil over their dying child. Tobias didn't know how long they prayed. Time seemed to lose its normal boundaries, but at some point, deep in the night, he felt Samuel's hand grip his shoulder. "Look," Samuel breathed. The boy's breathing had changed. It was slower, deeper, more regular. The flush in his cheeks was fading, and as they watched, his eyes opened, clear eyes, focused and present, looking up at his father. "Abba," the boy said, his voice hoarse but steady. "I'm thirsty." Rachel sobbed and scrambled to get water. The boy drank deeply, then looked around the room as if seeing it for the first time. His gaze settled on Tobias. "Who are you?" he asked. "A friend of your father's," Tobias said, smiling. "How do you feel?" "Tired," the boy said, "but the burning is gone. I had strange dreams. I dreamed I was flying, but I wasn't using wings. I was under wings, big wings that covered the whole sky. Tobias and Samuel exchanged glances. Rachel pressed her hand to her mouth, fresh tears streaming down her face, but these were tears of a different kind. "Sleep now," Tobias said to the boy. "When you wake, you'll be stronger." The boy's eyes closed, and this time his sleep was natural, restorative. The crisis had passed. Tobias stayed with Samuel's family for 3 days, watching as the boy's strength returned. By the second day, he was sitting up, eating bread and asking for honey. By the third day, he was walking in the courtyard, though his legs were still weak. During those days, the whole village came to hear what had happened. They gathered in Samuel's courtyard in the evenings, and Tobias found himself teaching the psalm again and again. Old women who had seen many seasons came to learn it. Young fathers who worried about protecting their families came to hear. Even the village elders came, and though some were skeptical, others recognized the truth in the words. On the morning Tobias prepared to leave, Samuel walked with him to the edge of the village. "How can I repay you?" Samuel asked. "You can't," Tobias said simply, "and you don't need to. What happened here wasn't my doing. I was just a witness, someone who stood in the gap and reminded us all that we don't stand alone." "The psalm," Samuel said, "it's changed everything, not just for my family, but for the whole village. We say it together now at evening prayers. The words are becoming part of us." Tobias nodded. "That's how it should be. These aren't words to be hoarded or kept secret. They're meant to be shared, to be lived, to become the foundation we build our lives upon." He started down the path, then turned back. "Samuel, when your son is older, teach him the psalm. Tell him the story of how his father traveled 3 days to find help, how his mother kept vigil through the darkest night, how they learned to dwell in the secret place. Let it become part of his story, too." "I will," Samuel promised. "And Tobias, thank you, not just for the words, but for showing us that they're true." The journey back to Beth Zur took Tobias through new territory. Instead of retracing his steps, he took a different route, one that led through the hill country of Judea. The landscape here was stark and beautiful, all limestone outcroppings and scrub vegetation, with olive groves terraced into the hillsides wherever soil could gather. As he walked, Tobias reflected on what had happened. He hadn't healed Samuel's son. He was certain of that. He had no special powers, no mystical abilities. All he had done was stand in faith, recite words of trust, and trust that God was who he said he was. And somehow that had been enough, or rather, God had been enough. The distinction was important. Tobias was learning that faith wasn't about his strength or his worthiness. It wasn't about earning God's favor or performing the right rituals. It was about recognizing a reality that already existed, that God was faithful, God was present, God was protective. The secret place wasn't something Tobias had to create or conjure into being. It already existed. He just had to learn to dwell there. Late afternoon on the second day of his journey, Tobias crested a ridge and saw a sight that stopped him in his tracks. Spread out in the valley below was what appeared to be a small encampment of travelers. But as he watched, he realized it was more than that. There were perhaps 50 people gathered around several large fires, and the sound of singing drifted up to him. Not just any singing, but the kind of communal worship he had heard in the synagogue, multiple voices blending in ancient harmonies. Curious, Tobias made his way down into the valley. As he approached, several men came to meet him, their faces open and friendly. "Shalom, traveler," one of them said. "You're welcome to share our fire and our meal." "Shalom," Tobias replied. "What brings so many of you together in this place?" "We're pilgrims," the man explained, "traveling to Jerusalem for the Feast of Tabernacles. We come from different villages, but we travel together for safety and fellowship. My name is Matthias." "I'm Tobias from Beth-zur." Matthias's eyes brightened. "Beth-zur? Then perhaps you're the one we've heard about. The young shepherd who faced a lion? Who knows the psalm of protection?" Tobias was surprised by how far word had traveled. "I am he, though the story has perhaps grown larger in the telling." "Come," Matthias said, gripping his arm. "You must meet our company. We have many who would benefit from hearing your testimony." Tobias was led into the camp where people of all ages had gathered. There were families with small children, elderly couples supporting each other as they made their pilgrimage, young men traveling together, groups of women chatting as they prepared the evening meal. All of them were making the journey to Jerusalem, following the ancient commandment to appear before the Lord 3 times a year. That evening, as they sat around the fires under a sky blazing with stars, Tobias told his story. He spoke of his fear, of the storm, of the lion, of the choice he had made to trust rather than flee. He recited the psalm, and the pilgrims listened with rapt attention. When he finished, there was a long silence, broken only by the crackling of the fires and the distant howl of a jackal. Then an old woman spoke up from across the fire. Her voice was thin but clear. "I have walked this earth for 70 years," she said. "I have seen wars and famines, plagues and prosperity. I have buried children and grandchildren, and I can tell you that what this young man speaks is true. God's wings are real. They have covered me more times than I can count." She stood, with some difficulty, and began to share her own stories, how her husband had been killed in a border skirmish when she was young, leaving her with 3 small children and no means of support, how she had cried out to God in her desperation, and how provision had come in unexpected ways. How her children had grown and prospered, how grandchildren had been born, how through all the sorrows and joys she had felt the presence of the Almighty sheltering her. Her testimony opened a floodgate. One by one, others began to share. A merchant told of being caught in a sandstorm that should have killed him, but a cave had appeared seemingly out of nowhere. A mother spoke of her daughter's recovery from a deadly illness. A young man described being lost in the wilderness for 3 days, certain he would die, only to be found by a passing caravan at the very moment his water ran out. Each story was different, but all of them pointed to the same truth, that God was faithful, God was present, God was protective. The psalm Tobias had shared wasn't just beautiful poetry. It was testimony. It was the collective experience of generations who had learned to dwell in the secret place. The fire burned low as the night deepened, but no one wanted to leave. There was something holy about this gathering, this sharing of sacred stories. Tobias realized he was witnessing something profound. These weren't just isolated incidents of divine intervention. They were threads in a larger tapestry, a pattern of faithfulness that stretched back through time and would extend forward into the future. Finally, Matthias stood and raised his hands. "Brothers and sisters," he said, "let us pray together the psalm we have heard tonight. Let us declare our trust in the one who has brought us this far and will bring us safely to Jerusalem." And so, under the stars, 50 voices joined together in recitation. Some knew the psalm already, having learned it in their youth. Others repeated what they could remember from Tobias's recitation. Still others simply listened, letting the words wash over them like water in a dry land. "He who dwells in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress, my God. In Him I will trust." The words rose into the night air, a declaration of faith that seemed to echo off the hills and return to them amplified. Tobias felt tears on his cheeks, though he couldn't have said exactly why. Perhaps it was the beauty of so many voices united in trust. Perhaps it was the sense of being part of something much larger than himself. Perhaps it was simply the overwhelming gratitude of knowing that he belonged to a people who knew how to hope, even in darkness. When the prayer ended, people began to drift toward their sleeping places, but many stopped by where Tobias sat to grasp his hand, to thank him for sharing, to tell him that they would carry the psalm with them to Jerusalem and beyond. Matthias sat down beside him as the camp settled into sleep. "You have a gift?" he said quietly. "The psalm isn't mine," Tobias protested. "I don't mean the psalm. I mean the ability to make it real, to connect it to lived experience. Many can recite words. Few can make others feel their truth." He paused, staring into the dying embers of the fire. "Have you considered that this might be your calling? Not just shepherding sheep, but shepherding souls? Teaching others how to dwell in the secret place?" Tobias had never thought of it in those terms. He was a shepherd. It was what he knew, what his father had taught him, what he had always expected to be. But as he considered Matthias's words, something stirred within him, a sense of possibility, of purpose beyond the daily routine of leading sheep to pasture. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I'm just a shepherd from a small village. I'm not a priest or a scribe. I have no formal training." David was a shepherd, Matthias said with a slight smile, and he wrote many of the psalms we sing. Moses tended his father-in-law's flocks before God called him to lead a nation. Amos was a shepherd before he became a prophet. God seems to have a pattern of calling shepherds to larger flocks. That night, lying on his mat with the breathing of 50 pilgrims creating a gentle symphony around him, Tobias stared up at the stars and wondered, was this what God wanted from him? To share not just the psalm, but the experience of dwelling in divine protection? To help others find the secret place? He didn't have answers, but he felt a peace about not having answers. The secret place, he was learning, wasn't just about protection from external dangers. It was also about rest in the midst of uncertainty. It was about trusting that God knew the path even when he couldn't see more than the next few steps. In the morning, the pilgrims prepared to continue their journey. Tobias had originally planned to return directly to Bethsur, but on impulse, he asked Matthias if he could join them to Jerusalem. "Of course," Matthias said, clearly delighted. "We would be honored to have you, though I warn you, everyone will want to hear more of your story." The journey to Jerusalem took 5 more days. The company moved slowly, accommodating the elderly and the children. Each evening, they would make camp, share a meal, and inevitably someone would ask Tobias to tell his story again or to teach them another passage. He found himself drawing not just on Psalm 91, but on other scriptures he had learned throughout his life. The teachings wove together, creating a tapestry of truth about God's character and his relationship with his people. On the 6th day, they crested the Mount of Olives, and there below them Jerusalem spread out in all its glory. The city walls gleamed white in the afternoon sun. The Temple Mount rose above everything else, its courtyards and columns visible even from this distance. Smoke from 1,000 cooking fires rose into the clear air. The city was swelling with pilgrims who had come from all over the land to celebrate the feast. Tobias had been to Jerusalem before, but never like this. Never as part of a community of pilgrims, never with this sense of shared purpose and joy. The company began to sing as they descended toward the city, one of the songs of ascent that pilgrims had sung for generations. "I was glad when they said to me, 'Let us go to the house of the Lord. Our feet have been standing within your gates, O Jerusalem.'" The city gates were crowded with travelers. Roman soldiers watched from their posts, maintaining a visible presence to discourage any trouble during the feast. But the atmosphere was festive rather than tense. Families called out to each other, recognizing relatives they hadn't seen since the last pilgrimage. Merchants hawked their wares. The smell of roasting meat and fresh bread filled the air. Matthias led their company to a large courtyard where they would camp during the feast. Other pilgrim groups were already there, constructing temporary shelters called booths or sukkahs, fulfilling the commandment to dwell in temporary structures during the feast, commemorating the wilderness wandering of their ancestors. Over the next several days, Tobias experienced Jerusalem during one of its most holy times. The temple courts were filled with worshipers. The sound of prayers and psalms never ceased. The priests in their white robes moved through the crowds, offering sacrifices, blessing the people, teaching the law. The Levites sang with voices trained from childhood to blend in perfect harmony. But what struck Tobias most was the diversity of the people. Jerusalem, during the feast, was a gathering of all Israel. There were merchants from the coast who smelled of the sea. There were farmers from the Jordan Valley with sun-darkened skin. There were scribes from the northern territories, scholars from the south, shepherds from the hill country. All of them had come to stand before the Lord, to remember their identity as His chosen people, to renew their covenant relationship. One afternoon, Tobias was exploring the outer courts of the temple when he heard a familiar voice. He turned, and there was Eleazar, his teacher from Bethzur, standing with a group of other elders engaged in deep discussion. Tobias! Eleazar's face lit up when he saw him. Come, join us. I want you to meet some friends. The old man introduced Tobias to several other teachers, men who had spent their lives studying the Scriptures and instructing the people. As they talked, Eleazar told them about Tobias's encounter with the lion, about how the psalm had become real to him through experience rather than just study. One of the teachers, a stern-looking man named Joachim, seemed skeptical. Stories of miracles are common during feast times, he said. People's emotions run high, and they see the hand of God in every coincidence. Tell me, Joachim, Eleazar said mildly, when was the last time you faced a lion? I don't spend my days in the wilderness, Joachim replied. I study the law in comfort and safety. Precisely, Eleazar said, and that is why this young man can teach us something that all our study has not revealed. He has learned what it means to trust God not in theory, but in practice. The secret place is not a concept to him. It's a reality he has experienced. But surely you're not suggesting that experience is more important than proper instruction, Joachim protested. I'm suggesting they need each other, Eleazar said. Instruction without experience becomes dry as dust. But experience without instruction can lead to error. This young man has both. He learned the psalm, and then he lived it. Now he can teach it in a way that transforms those who hear, because he's not just transmitting information, he's sharing testimony. The discussion continued, but Tobias felt uncomfortable being talked about as if he weren't there. He excused himself and wandered deeper into the temple courts, finding a quiet corner where he could simply sit and observe. The afternoon sun slanted through the columns, creating patterns of light and shadow on the stone floor. Tobias watched as people came and went, each absorbed in their own prayers and purposes. There was a woman standing with her hands raised, tears streaming down her face as she whispered prayers too quiet to hear. There was an old man bowing repeatedly, his lips moving in memorized liturgy. There was a young boy, perhaps 8 years old, standing very still beside his father, his eyes wide as he took in the magnificence of the place. Tobias thought about Joachim's skepticism and Eleazar's defense. In truth, he understood both perspectives. Before his encounter with the lion, he would have been more like Joachim, hearing stories of divine intervention with a certain intellectual distance. But now, having stood in the valley with death approaching, having felt the terror and chosen trust anyway, having witnessed the lion's inexplicable retreat, he couldn't dismiss such stories as coincidence or emotion. Yet he also recognized the danger Joachim hinted at, of making every experience into a miracle, of seeing divine intervention where there was simply natural causes, of becoming so focused on signs and wonders that the deeper work of transformation was missed. The truth, Tobias was learning, lay somewhere in the balance. God was sovereign over all things, working through both the miraculous and the mundane. Sometimes he intervened in dramatic ways, but more often he worked through the quiet faithfulness of ordinary people making ordinary choices to trust him one day at a time. The feast lasted 7 days, and each day brought new experiences. Tobias participated in the rituals, helped build and decorate booths, joined in the communal meals and celebrations. He met people from all over Israel, heard their stories, shared his own. The psalm continued to be his gift to others, and he found himself teaching it dozens of times, to individuals and groups, to young and old, to the desperate and the curious. On the last day of the feast, there was a great celebration involving water and light. The priests carried water from the pool of Siloam to the temple and poured it out as an offering, symbolizing prayers for rain and God's blessing on the land. As the water poured out, the people sang and danced, their joy overflowing like the water itself. That evening, as lamps and torches were lit throughout the temple courts, transforming the night into a blaze of light, Tobias stood with Matthias and watched the celebration. "What will you do now?" Matthias asked. "Will you return to Bethzur and your flock?" Tobias had been thinking about this question throughout the feast. "Yes," he said slowly, "I need to go home. My father needs help with the sheep, and my mother will be worried. But I think this is not the end of something. It's the beginning." "What do you mean?" "I mean that shepherding sheep is what I do, but perhaps it's not all I'm meant to do. I think God might be calling me to a larger flock. People who need to learn how to trust, how to dwell in the secret place. I don't know what that looks like yet, but I'm learning to be okay with not knowing." The secret place is also a place of trust in God's timing and leading. Matthias smiled. "Then I suspect we'll hear more of Tobias the shepherd in the years to come." The journey back to Bethzur took 4 days. Tobias traveled alone this time, as the pilgrim company dispersed, each person or family returning to their own homes throughout the land. But he didn't feel lonely. The silence of the wilderness was no longer threatening. It was contemplative space, room for reflection and prayer. As he walked the familiar paths, Tobias recited the psalm, letting its words sink even deeper into his heart. Each phrase had become rich with meaning, layered with memory and experience. He who dwells in the secret place of the Most High, he remembered the moment he had stepped out from safety to face the lion, shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. He thought of Samuel's son, covered by wings invisible but real. I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress. He recalled the pilgrims around the fire sharing their testimonies. My God, in Him I will trust. He felt the words settle into his bones, becoming part of his very identity. When Bethzer finally came into view, Tobias felt a rush of emotion. This was home. These hills, these people, this place where he had been born and raised. But he was returning transformed. He had left as a frightened boy and returned as a young man who had found something precious. Not certainty, but trust. Not the absence of fear, but the ability to act in faith despite fear. His mother saw him first. She had been grinding grain in the courtyard, and when she looked up and saw him approaching, she dropped the grinding stone and ran to meet him, her face alight with joy and relief. Tobias, thank God. We heard about the lion, and then you were gone so long and we didn't know. He embraced her, feeling her frame shaking with sobs of relief. I'm sorry, Emma. I should have sent word. There was so much to do, so many people to meet. His father came out of the house, and though Micah's face remained composed, Tobias could see the emotion in his eyes. They embraced in the way of men, brief but meaningful. Come, Micah said, you must be hungry. You must tell us everything. That evening, sitting in their courtyard as the sun set behind the western hills, Tobias told his parents about all that had happened. The healing of Samuel's son, the journey with the pilgrims, the feast in Jerusalem, the conversations with teachers and elders, the countless times he had shared the psalm and seen it transform those who heard. His parents listened without interruption, and when he finished, his father was quiet for a long moment. You've found your calling, Micah finally said. Haven't you? Tobias nodded slowly. I think so, though I'm not entirely sure what it means yet. I know I need to continue shepherding our flock. We depend on that for our livelihood. But I also know that God is calling me to something more, to help others find the secret place. Then we will support you, Naomi said firmly. Whatever form this calling takes, we will help however we can. In the weeks that followed, Tobias settled back into the rhythm of shepherding. Each morning he led the flock into the eastern valleys. Each evening he brought them safely home. But word had spread during his absence, and now people began coming to Bethzer specifically to see him. Shepherds from other villages, families dealing with crisis, young people searching for meaning and direction. Tobias would meet with them in the evenings after the sheep were penned. They would sit in his father's courtyard or walk through the olive groves, and he would share what he had learned. He would teach the psalm, but more importantly, he would help them understand what it meant to dwell in the secret place. One evening, a group of young shepherds came, all of them around Tobias's age or younger. They had heard the stories and wanted to know if what they heard was true. "Did you really face a lion with just a sling?" one asked. "I did," Tobias confirmed, "but that's not the important part of the story." "What is the important part?" another asked. "The important part is that I was terrified, more afraid than I'd ever been. And in that moment, I had a choice: trust my own strength, which I knew was inadequate, or trust in God's protection, which I couldn't see but had learned was real." He looked around at the young faces watching him. "You will all face your own lions," he said. "Maybe not literal lions. Maybe it will be sickness, or loss, or failure, or betrayal, or 100 other forms of danger and difficulty. But whatever lion you face, the question will be the same. Where will you put your trust?" "But how?" one of them asked. "How do you learn to trust when everything in you is screaming to run?" "You start before the lion appears," Tobias said. "You don't wait until the crisis to begin building your foundation of trust. You start now, in the ordinary moments. You practice seeing God's provision in small things. You learn to recognize His presence in daily life. You memorize His promises and let them take root in your heart. Then, when the lion comes, you have something to stand on." He taught them the psalm that night, all of them sitting in a circle under the stars, their voices blending as they recited it together, and Tobias felt a deep satisfaction knowing that these young shepherds were learning what he had learned, that the truth was being passed on to another generation. Autumn turned to winter, and still people came. Tobias found himself becoming a kind of informal teacher. Though he never claimed any special authority, he simply shared what he had experienced and what he had learned from Scripture. His reputation grew, and with it came challenges. Some of the village elders were suspicious of his influence, worried that a young man without formal training was taking on a teaching role. Others were jealous, feeling that Tobias was receiving attention and respect that should go to those with more years and study. One Shabbat, after the service, one of the elders confronted him publicly in the synagogue courtyard. "By what authority do you teach?" the man demanded. His name was Levi, and he was known for his strict adherence to tradition. "You are not a priest. You are not a scribe. You are a shepherd, and yet you presume to instruct others in spiritual matters." Tobias felt the eyes of the whole community on him. He took a deep breath and prayed silently for wisdom. "You're right," he said calmly. "I am a shepherd. I have no formal training, but I'm not teaching my own wisdom. I'm sharing Scripture that has been taught to me, and I'm testifying to what I have experienced of God's faithfulness. Is that not what we're all called to do? To pass on what we have received?" "Experience can be deceptive," Levi argued. "Only proper training ensures correct interpretation." "Then teach me." Tobias said simply. "If my understanding is incorrect, show me from Scripture where I'm wrong. I'm not trying to replace the teachers and elders. I'm just trying to help people know that God's promises are real." Eleazar, who had been listening, stepped forward. "Levi, do you remember what Moses said when Joshua tried to stop others from prophesying? Would that all the Lord's people were prophets, and that the Lord would put his Spirit upon them? God does not limit his work to those with credentials. He chooses whom he will to accomplish his purposes." The confrontation ended there, but Tobias knew it was just the beginning of a tension that would continue. Not everyone would appreciate his ministry. Some would see him as a threat to established order. Others would misunderstand his message or try to use his name for their own purposes. That night, lying on his rooftop, Tobias wrestled with doubt. Was he being presumptuous? Should he stop teaching and just focus on his sheep? Was he causing more division than healing? He recited the psalm again, letting the familiar words wash over him like cool water. "He who dwells in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty." As he spoke, he felt the tension begin to ease. The answer came not as a voice or a vision, but as a quiet knowing deep in his spirit. He was not called to have all the answers. He was simply called to share what he had experienced and to trust God with the results. Some would receive his testimony. Others would reject it. Both responses were beyond his control. What mattered was faithfulness to the calling, not the outcome of that faithfulness. With this understanding came a deep peace. Tobias smiled up at the stars, feeling once again the covering of those invisible wings. The secret place was not just a refuge from external dangers, it was also a refuge from the internal tyranny of needing to control, to succeed, to be understood and appreciated by all. The weeks turned into months, and winter gave way to spring once more. A full year had passed since Tobias's encounter with the lion. The anniversary fell on a day when he was leading the flock through the same valley where it had happened. He stood at the spot where he had faced the great cat, and the memory was as vivid as if it had occurred yesterday. But now, with the perspective of time, he could see how that single moment had been the beginning of something far larger than he could have imagined. That evening, back in Bethser, a messenger arrived from Jerusalem. He carried a sealed letter addressed to Tobias, son of Micah. With trembling hands, Tobias broke the seal and unrolled the parchment. The letter was from a council of teachers and elders in Jerusalem. They had heard of his testimony and his teaching of Psalm 91. They wrote, "Tobias, son of Micah, greetings and peace." "Word has reached us of the work you are doing among the shepherds and people of the hill country, teaching them to dwell in the secret place of the Most High. We have interviewed many who have heard your testimony, and we find in your teaching a faithfulness to Scripture and a depth of understanding that comes from lived experience rather than mere study. We write to invite you to come to Jerusalem during the next Feast of Weeks. There is a gathering of teachers from throughout the land, and we believe your voice would add much to our discussions of how faith is lived in the daily struggles of God's people. This is not a summons, but an invitation. Pray about whether this is a path the Lord would have you walk. Tobias read the letter 3 times, each time feeling a different emotion. First came surprise, then came fear of inadequacy. Finally came a strange sense of rightness, as if this were a next step he had been unconsciously preparing for. He showed the letter to his parents that evening. His mother's eyes filled with tears, though she smiled. "I knew," she said softly. "From the day you returned from facing that lion, I knew God had marked you for something beyond our small village. But oh, my son, how I will miss you." "I'm not leaving permanently, Emma," Tobias said. "It's just a visit to Jerusalem." "For now," his father said wisely. "But seeds planted in Jerusalem have a way of growing. Whatever comes of this, Tobias, know that your mother and I are proud of you. You have honored our family and honored God." The Feast of Weeks was still 2 months away, which gave Tobias time to prepare, but more importantly, it gave him time to continue his daily work. He realized that his effectiveness in teaching about the secret place came not from setting aside normal life, but from living that teaching in the midst of ordinary shepherding, ordinary relationships, ordinary struggles. One morning, during those weeks of preparation, Tobias led his flock to a new pasture he had discovered, a hidden valley where a spring fed a small meadow of rich grass. As the sheep grazed contentedly, he sat in the shade of an ancient oak and allowed himself to simply be present in the moment. The morning sun filtered through the leaves, creating patterns of light and shadow on the ground. A breeze carried the scent of wild herbs. The sheep made their soft sounds of satisfaction. A bird sang somewhere in the branches above. In this moment, there was no fear, no anxiety about the future, no wrestling with questions he couldn't answer. There was only the present moment and the presence of God within it. This, Tobias realized, was the secret place in its purest form. Not a dramatic mountaintop experience or a miraculous deliverance from danger, but simply this: the ability to be fully present, fully aware of God's presence in an ordinary moment on an ordinary day. He thought of all the people he had taught over the past year: the frightened shepherds, the sick children, the doubting elders, the curious pilgrims. What he had been trying to give them was not a formula for miracles or a guarantee against suffering. It was this simple, profound gift: the ability to dwell in God's presence regardless of circumstances. You shall not be afraid, the psalm promised, not because nothing frightening would ever happen, but because even in the presence of terror, there was a deeper reality. God's sheltering wings, His constant presence, His faithful love. As Tobias sat in that hidden valley, he began to understand something new about his calling. He was not meant to be a warrior who battled lions, or a miracle worker who healed the sick, or even a great teacher who drew crowds with his wisdom. He was meant to be a witness, a simple witness who pointed others toward a reality he had discovered, that God was faithful, God was present, and in Him was a place of absolute safety and peace. The thought was both humbling and liberating. It meant his worth didn't depend on dramatic stories or impressive credentials. It depended only on his willingness to testify to what he knew to be true. A few weeks before he was scheduled to leave for Jerusalem, something happened that would become one of the most important experiences of Tobias's life, though at the time it seemed like a simple pastoral duty. An old shepherd named Josiah, who lived in a neighboring village, sent word that he was dying and wished to speak with Tobias. Josiah had been a shepherd for more than 60 years. He had weathered droughts and floods, wars and plagues. He had buried 2 wives and 3 of his 7 children. His body was failing now, worn out by decades of hard labor and exposure to the elements. Tobias arrived at Josiah's house to find the old man lying on a mat, his breathing labored, his skin the color of old parchment. But his eyes were still clear, still sharp, with the intelligence that had guided flocks through 6 decades of changing seasons. Tobias! Josiah's voice was barely a whisper. They say you know the secret place. I'm still learning it, Josiah, Tobias replied, kneeling beside the mat. But yes, I have dwelt there. Tell me, the old man said. I'm afraid. After all these years of faith, after all the prayers and sacrifices, I find myself afraid of what comes next. Is that weakness? Is that failure? Tobias took the old man's weathered hand in his own young, strong one. It's not weakness. It's humanity. Even those who dwell in the secret place feel fear. The difference is we don't let fear have the final word. He began to recite the psalm, slowly letting each phrase rest in the air. He who dwells in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. As he spoke, he watched Josiah's face. The lines of tension gradually smoothed. The rapid, shallow breathing began to slow and deepen. Under his wings, Josiah murmured, like a mother bird with her chicks. Yes, Tobias said. And Josiah, you've been under those wings your whole life. Every flock you brought safely home, every child you raised, every hardship you endured. You never fell out of his care, and you won't fall out of it now. Tears leaked from the corners of Josiah's eyes. I've been a shepherd so long, he said. It's hard to think of myself as the sheep. But that's what we all are, Tobias said gently. Even those of us who tend flocks. We're all sheep under the care of the great shepherd, and he never loses even one of us. They sat together for a long time, sometimes in silence, sometimes with Tobias reciting portions of the psalm or other scriptures. Josiah's family came and went, bringing water, adjusting blankets, but mostly just keeping vigil. As the sun began to set, painting the walls of the small house in shades of gold and amber, Josiah squeezed Tobias's hand with surprising strength. "I see them," he said, his voice suddenly clear and strong. "The wings. They've been there all along, haven't they? I just couldn't see them. But now—" His voice trailed off, but his face was radiant with wonder. His breathing changed, becoming slower, deeper, more peaceful. And then, with one final exhale, Josiah entered the presence of the shepherd he had served all his life. Tobias stayed with the family through the night, helping them prepare the body according to custom, sitting with them in their grief. But there was something different about this grief. It was real, certainly. The family would miss Josiah terribly. But underneath the sorrow was a foundation of peace, a certainty that Josiah had not been lost, but had simply moved from one pasture to another, still under the care of the same faithful shepherd. The experience marked Tobias deeply. He realized that the secret place was not just for the young and strong, not just for those facing lions in the wilderness. It was for everyone at every stage of life, including and especially at the end of life. The wings that covered a young shepherd in a valley covered an old shepherd breathing his last. The promise was universal and eternal. When the time came to leave for Jerusalem, Tobias found himself ready in a way he hadn't expected. The weeks since Josiah's death had brought a new maturity to his faith. He had seen the secret place work not just in dramatic deliverances, but in quiet endings, not just in miraculous healings, but in peaceful passings. The truth of God's covering was not limited to certain types of experiences. It was comprehensive, encompassing all of life and even death itself. His parents blessed him before he left, his father placing both hands on his head in the ancient way of patriarchs. "The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace." His mother pressed food for the journey into his hands and kissed both his cheeks. "Come back to us," she said. "No matter what doors open in Jerusalem, always remember that you have a home here." The journey to Jerusalem took 3 days. Tobias traveled with a group of merchants and pilgrims, and along the way he found himself sharing the psalm with fellow travelers. By the time they reached the city gates, several of them could recite it from memory, and one merchant had asked Tobias to teach it to his children when they arrived. Jerusalem, during the Feast of Weeks, was different from the Feast of Tabernacles. The crowd was smaller, but no less fervent. The city celebrated the giving of the Torah at Sinai, the moment when God's law had been etched in stone and delivered to Moses. It was a feast of covenant, of divine instruction, of the relationship between God and His people formalized in words and commandments. Tobias was directed to a large house in the upper city, where the council of teachers had arranged lodging for visiting scholars and teachers. The house belonged to a wealthy merchant named Nicodemus, a man known for his support of religious education and his desire to see the common people gain access to the wisdom of the Scriptures. The gathering of teachers began the following day. About 40 men assembled in the courtyard of Nicodemus's house, sitting on benches arranged in a large circle. They ranged in age from young scribes barely older than Tobias to ancient rabbis whose beards were white as snow. The discussion began with questions about how to teach faith to the next generation. How could the truths of Scripture be made real to young people growing up in a world increasingly influenced by Greek and Roman culture? How could the stories of Abraham and Moses compete with the philosophy of Athens and the power of Rome? Tobias listened for most of the morning, intimidated by the learning and eloquence of the speakers. These were men who had studied the Torah for decades, who could quote vast passages from memory, who understood the intricate debates and interpretations that had accumulated around every verse. But then one of the older teachers posed a question that seemed directed at Tobias, though he didn't name him specifically. "We can teach the words of Scripture," the man said. "We can explain their meanings and explore their depths." But how do we help people experience the reality those words describe? How do we move faith from the head to the heart? There was a long silence. Then Eleazar, who had traveled from Bethzur for the feast, spoke up. "I believe Tobias, the young shepherd from Bethzur, might have something to offer on this question." All eyes turned to Tobias. He felt his face flush and his throat go dry. But then he remembered standing before the lion, remembered the terror and the choice to speak truth in the face of fear. This was just another kind of lion, a more sophisticated one perhaps, but no more powerful than the God who covered him. He stood, his voice quiet but steady. "Honored teachers, I am no scholar. I cannot debate the finer points of interpretation, but I can tell you what I have learned. Faith becomes real, not through more study, but through testing. It becomes real when we face situations that require us to trust in what we cannot see." He told them his story then, not as a boast, but as testimony. The storm, the lion, the moment of choice, the inexplicable deliverance. He told them about Samuel's son, about Josiah's death, about the countless people who had learned to recite Psalm 91 not as beautiful poetry, but as lived reality. The secret place is not a metaphor, Tobias said. It is a real position we can occupy, a real shelter we can dwell in. But most people will never discover it in a classroom or a synagogue. They will discover it in the wilderness when everything else has been stripped away, and they must choose between fear and trust. When he finished, there was silence. Tobias worried he had overstepped, that his simple shepherd's faith would seem naive to these learned men. But then one of the eldest teachers, a man named Simeon, spoke. "This young man speaks truth," Simeon said. "We have made the Scriptures into an academic pursuit when they were meant to be a guide for living. We have turned faith into a subject to be studied when it was meant to be a reality to be experienced. Perhaps we need fewer scholars and more shepherds." The comment sparked a lively debate that continued through the afternoon. Some teachers agreed with Simeon, arguing that religious education had become too theoretical, too disconnected from daily life. Others worried that emphasizing experience over study could lead to error and superstition. Tobias listened to the debate with fascination, learning from these men even as they debated his testimony. He realized that both sides were partially right. Experience without instruction could indeed lead astray. But instruction without experience was equally problematic, creating people who knew about God without truly knowing God. The gathering continued for 3 days. Each day brought new discussions, new debates, new insights. Tobias contributed when asked, but mostly he listened and learned. He met teachers from Galilee and Samaria, from the coastal cities and the desert regions. Each brought a different perspective, shaped by the geography and culture of their region. On the final day of the feast, the teachers gathered one last time. The discussion turned to practical matters: how to continue their collaboration, how to share insights and resources, how to support each other's work. It was then that Nicodemus, their host, made a surprising proposal. "I have been listening to these discussions with great interest," he said, "and it seems to me that we need a new kind of teacher, someone who bridges the gap between scholarship and experience, someone who can speak the language of the common people while remaining faithful to the truths of Scripture." He turned to Tobias. "Young man, I would like to sponsor your education. I will provide you with lodging here in Jerusalem, access to teachers and scrolls, opportunity to learn. In exchange, I ask only that you continue to teach what you know to those who will never have access to formal education, the shepherds, the laborers, the poor. Teach them to dwell in the secret place." The offer was staggering. To study in Jerusalem, to have access to the greatest teachers and the most extensive libraries. It was an opportunity most boys from villages like Bethza could never dream of. But it would also mean leaving his family, leaving his flock, leaving the life he had always known. "I cannot give you an answer now," Tobias said. "This is a decision I must make with prayer and counsel from my father." Of course, Nicodemus said. Take all the time you need. The offer will remain open. That night, Tobias walked through the streets of Jerusalem, wrestling with this new possibility. The city was quieter now, as many pilgrims had already begun their journeys home. Lamps glowed in windows, and the sound of evening prayers drifted from various houses. He found himself drawn to the Temple Mount, though the courts were closed for the night. He stood outside the walls, looking up at the massive structure that dominated the city's skyline. Somewhere inside, priests were performing the evening rituals. Incense was rising, prayers were being offered. The eternal rhythm of worship continued. Tobias thought about what Nicodemus was offering. Part of him longed to accept, to learn, to grow, to become a more effective teacher. But another part of him worried. Would formal education change him? Would studying in Jerusalem disconnect him from the simple, lived faith that had made his testimony powerful? He prayed for wisdom, reciting the psalm that had become his anchor. He who dwells in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. As he prayed, a memory came to him. The hidden valley where he had taken his flock, the morning spent in simple presence, the realization that the secret place was not found in dramatic experiences, but in ordinary moments of awareness. The answer came not as a revelation, but as a quiet knowing. He could study in Jerusalem without losing his connection to the ordinary. He could learn from scholars without forgetting the lessons learned in the wilderness. The key was to remember that education was meant to serve faith, not replace it. He would accept Nicodemus's offer, but he would also return regularly to Bethzur, to the sheep, to the simple life that had shaped him. He would be a bridge between two worlds, the world of learning and the world of living. The journey back to Bethzur to tell his parents took another 3 days. When he arrived home, he found them in the courtyard, his mother spinning wool, his father mending a leather strap. They looked up as he entered, and his mother's face broke into a smile of joy and relief. "You're back. Tell us everything." Tobias sat with them as the sun set, sharing all that had happened, the gathering of teachers, the debates, the offer from Nicodemus. When he finished, his parents were quiet for a long moment. Finally, his father spoke. "This is a great honor, Tobias, and I believe it is from God. You must accept." "But the flock," Tobias protested. "You need help." "I managed before you were old enough to help, and I will manage again," Micah said firmly. "Besides, your younger cousin Asher is nearly old enough to take on more responsibility. The flock will be fine." His mother was crying, but she nodded. "Your father is right. This is your calling. We have always known you were meant for more than just our small village." "I'll come back often," Tobias promised. "Jerusalem isn't so far, and I need to keep my connection to this place, to this life." It's what makes my teaching real." "Then go with our blessing," his father said. "But never forget who you are. You are Tobias, son of Micah, a shepherd of Bethzur. No matter what titles or honors you may gain in Jerusalem, that is your true identity." The word settled into Tobias's heart like an anchor. Yes, that was who he was, and that was who he would remain, no matter where his path led. The arrangements took several weeks. Tobias spent that time training his cousin Asher, passing on everything he knew about the flock, the pastures, the dangers to watch for. He taught the boy the psalm, explaining how it had saved his life and transformed his understanding of faith. "The sheep need a shepherd who trusts in the great shepherd," Tobias told Asher. "Remember that. You're not just protecting them with your staff and your sling, you're protecting them by dwelling in the secret place." Finally, the day came to leave. Tobias packed his few possessions, an extra tunic, his writing materials, and the small scroll of psalms his father had given him as a parting gift. "This belonged to my father," Micah said as he pressed it into Tobias's hands, "and his father before him. 4 generations of shepherds have carried this scroll. Now it's yours. Let it remind you where you come from." The journey back to Jerusalem felt different this time. Tobias wasn't a visitor anymore. He was moving toward a new life, a new phase of his calling. As he walked the familiar roads, he found himself seeing everything with fresh eyes, as if memorizing details he might need to recall later. When he arrived in Jerusalem and presented himself at Nicodemus's house, he was welcomed warmly. A room had been prepared for him, small but comfortable, with a window that looked out over the city. A writing desk held fresh parchment and ink. A shelf waited for scrolls he would study. His education began immediately. Nicodemus arranged for him to study with several different teachers, each specializing in different aspects of Scripture and tradition. In the mornings, he studied Torah with Rabbi Gamaliel, a brilliant teacher known for his insights into the law. In the afternoons, he studied the prophets with a scholar named Hillel. In the evenings, he joined discussions about the Psalms and wisdom literature. But true to his promise, Tobias also spent time with the common people of Jerusalem. On Shabbat afternoons, after the formal services, he would gather with groups of laborers and merchants, shepherds who had come to sell their wool, poor families who lived in the lower city. With them, he would share the psalm and teach about dwelling in the secret place. His audiences were different from the learned scholars. They didn't ask questions about textual interpretation or debate fine points of meaning. They asked practical questions. How do I trust God when I can't feed my children? How do I find peace when Roman soldiers patrol our streets? How do I believe in divine protection when my brother was killed by bandits? These questions kept Tobias grounded. They reminded him that faith wasn't primarily an intellectual exercise. It was a daily choice made by people facing real struggles and real dangers. Months passed, then a full year. Tobias's reputation grew. He became known as the shepherd teacher, the one who could speak to both scholars and common folk. Invitations came to teach in other cities, to share his testimony in synagogues throughout Judea. But Tobias was careful to maintain balance. For every week he spent in Jerusalem studying and teaching, he would spend several days back in Beth-zur, helping with the flock, reconnecting with the simple rhythms of shepherding life. These visits home became essential to his spiritual health, keeping him anchored in the reality that had first taught him about the secret place. During one of these visits home, about 2 years after he had moved to Jerusalem, Tobias took the flock into the eastern valleys alone for the first time in months. Asher was capable now and didn't need constant supervision. But Tobias wanted this time with the sheep, this return to his roots. He led them to the same valley where he had faced the lion. The stream still trickled between rocks. The grass was still green, but everything felt different now, not because the place had changed, but because he had. He sat on the same rock where he had eaten his bread the day of the storm. He looked at the ridge where the lion had appeared, and he felt a wave of gratitude so intense it brought tears to his eyes. That moment of terror, that choice to trust, had set him on a path he never could have imagined, from a frightened shepherd boy to a teacher in Jerusalem, from someone who feared lions to someone who helped others face their own lions. But more than the external changes, he thought about the internal transformation. He had learned what it meant to dwell in the secret place, not as a theological concept, but as a daily reality. He had learned that God's wings were always covering him, whether he felt them or not. He had learned that faith was not about the absence of fear, but about the presence of trust, even in fear. He recited the psalm there in the valley, his voice echoing off the rocks. He who dwells in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress, my God, in Him I will trust. The words were the same words Eleazar had taught him years ago, but they were also completely different, enriched by years of experience, deepened by countless moments of choosing trust over fear. Surely He shall deliver you from the snare of the fowler and from the perilous pestilence. He shall cover you with His feathers, and under His wings you shall take refuge. His truth shall be your shield and buckler. He thought of all the people he had taught these words to. Samuel's son, now healthy and strong, young Seth, who had become a confident shepherd, the pilgrims he had met, now scattered throughout the land, the families in Jerusalem who gathered to hear him teach, each one learning to find their own way into the secret place. You shall not be afraid of the terror by night, nor of the arrow that flies by day, nor of the pestilence that walks in darkness, nor of the destruction that lays waste at noonday. He thought of Josiah dying peacefully after finally seeing the wings that had covered him all along. He thought of his own parents, aging now but secure in their faith. He thought of all the terrors, arrows, pestilences, and destructions that people faced every day, and how the promise held true for all of them. 1,000 may fall at your side, and 10,000 at your right hand, but it shall not come near you. Only with your eyes shall you look and see the reward of the wicked. The words were not a guarantee of physical immunity from harm. Tobias had learned that. People of faith still suffered, still died, still faced loss and pain. But they faced these things from within the shelter of God's presence. They faced them knowing they were not alone, not abandoned, not outside the circle of divine love. Because you have made the Lord, who is my refuge, even the Most High, your dwelling place, no evil shall befall you, nor shall any plague come near your dwelling. The key word was dwelling. This wasn't about a momentary visit to God's presence, but about making it your home, living there, abiding there, choosing day after day, moment after moment, to trust in God's faithful love. For he shall give his angels charge over you to keep you in all your ways. In their hands they shall bear you up, lest you dash your foot against a stone. Tobias thought of all the times he had been kept, protected, guided. Sometimes through dramatic interventions like the lightning that had frightened the lion, but more often through ordinary providence, paths that led safely home, dangers that didn't materialize, needs that were met in unexpected ways. You shall tread upon the lion and the cobra, the young lion and the serpent you shall trample underfoot. He had tread upon one lion, literally, but he had tread upon many more metaphorical lions: fear, doubt, inadequacy, criticism. Each time he chose trust over terror, he was trampling these enemies underfoot. Because he has set his love upon me, therefore I will deliver him. I will set him on high, because he has known my name. He shall call upon me, and I will answer him. I will be with him in trouble. I will deliver him and honor him. With long life I will satisfy him and show him my salvation. The final verses were God's voice, speaking promises to those who dwell in the secret place. Tobias let the words wash over him, receiving them not as distant hopes, but as present realities. He had called upon God, and God had answered. God had been with him in trouble. God was showing him salvation, not just in some future moment, but here and now, in this valley, on this day. He sat in silence for a long time after finishing the psalm, watching the sheep graze, listening to the sounds of the valley. Peace settled over him like a gentle weight, grounding him, centering him. This was why he had to keep coming back. This was why the time in the wilderness was as important as the time in Jerusalem. Without this, without the simplicity of shepherding and the silence of solitude, he would lose touch with the source of his teaching. As the sun began to set, Tobias gathered the flock and began the journey home. The path was familiar now, worn smooth by countless feet over countless generations. He thought about how many other shepherds had walked this way, how many had faced their own lions, how many had learned their own lessons about trust and faith. He was part of a long tradition, a chain of witnesses stretching back to David the shepherd king, back to Moses the reluctant prophet, back to Abraham the father of faith. Each generation learned the same essential truth, that God was faithful, that His promises were sure, that dwelling in His presence was the safest and best place to be. When he reached Bethzur, his parents were waiting as always. His mother embraced him tightly, and his father smiled with quiet pride. "You're home," his mother said. "Yes," Tobias replied, "I'm home." But he knew now that home had a double meaning. There was this home, this place, this family and village. But there was also another home, the secret place, the shelter of the Most High's wings, and that home traveled with him wherever he went. That evening, sitting in the courtyard with his parents as the stars emerged one by one, Tobias felt a profound contentment. He had been given so much, a calling, an education, opportunities to teach and influence others. But none of it compared to the simple gift of knowing that he dwelt in the secret place. Everything else might be taken away. His health might fail, his reputation might be destroyed, his opportunities might vanish, but the secret place would remain, because it wasn't dependent on external circumstances. It was the eternal reality of God's faithful love, always present, always covering, always sheltering those who chose to dwell there. As the night deepened and his parents retired to sleep, Tobias remained in the courtyard, looking up at the vast sweep of stars. He thought about all the people who were, at this very moment, learning to dwell in the secret place. Some through dramatic encounters like his lion, others through quiet surrender, like Josiah's death. Still others through the slow accumulation of small choices to trust rather than fear. The psalm was spreading as he had hoped, but more importantly, the reality behind the psalm was being discovered by countless souls. They were learning that the words were more than beautiful poetry. They were testimony. They were truth. They were an invitation to a way of living that transcended circumstances. Tobias smiled up at the stars, his heart full of gratitude and peace. His journey had begun with terror in a valley, but it had led to this, a life rooted in trust, a calling to help others find the same shelter he had found, and the deep joy of knowing that no matter what came, he dwelt forever under the shadow of the Almighty's wings. The night wind rustled through the olive trees, carrying with it the scent of earth and herbs. Somewhere in the distance, a sheep bleated softly. The lamp in the courtyard flickered gently, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. And Tobias, shepherd of Bethzur, teacher in Jerusalem, witness to the secret place, closed his eyes and rested in the peace that surpasses understanding. Safely sheltered beneath wings he could not see but knew with absolute certainty were there. The secret place had been found, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.